Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. A journalist and author, Daniel Hannan has since 1999, correct me if I make a mistake here, been a British member of the European Parliament. He first came to wide notice here in the United States when he made a speech on the floor of the European Parliament, addressing the then Prime Minister of Great Britain, Gordon Brown. I'll quote you, or you probably have this all but memorized. "You cannot spend your way out of recession," he said to the Prime Minister. "And when you repeat in that wooden and perfunctory way that we are well placed to weather the storm, I have to tell you, you sound like a Brezhnev-era apparatchik giving the party line." Mr. Hannan has just published a new book, The New Road to Serfdom, a letter of warning to America. Daniel Hannan, welcome.
Thank you.
Segment 1, what makes America different? When you were 18, you write in this book, you and some friends took a trip to the United States. Let me quote you. "We kept finding the same character traits: enthusiasm, artlessness, impatience, optimism. Only much later did it occur to me that these are not innate characteristics." Explain.
Well, very often when you talk about what makes American politics different, people on both sides of the Atlantic will say, well, it's culture. You know, Americans they're undeferential, they're restless, they don't have the class systems and the monarchies that Europe has and so on. But that answer doesn't really take you very far. I mean, culture isn't some numinous entity that exists alongside institutions. It's a product of institutions. There are reasons why there is a Tea Party here and there isn't a Tea Party in Europe. And if you break it down, what's happening in the US that's different? It's the single biggest factor actually is open primaries. There's a Tea Party here because people think that there's a purpose to it. Mm-hmm. My constituents,
what you mean by open primaries?
In most of Europe, in most of the democratic world, in fact everywhere really other than the US, candidates are chosen by their parties and are then presented to the electorate, right, which means in effect that they're chosen by the party leader and his clique. And this allows the political parties to exclude big mainstream currents of public opinion from the legislature. Now, all of the evidence I have is that people in Britain and people in Europe dislike the level of taxation just as much as Americans do. In fact, they've got a lot more to complain about in terms of the overall level of tax. So the reason there is a Tea Party here is not because of some perverse American characteristic of being anti-tax. It's that people think that they can do something about it through the ballot box. And that is an incredibly precious thing you have. Very few of my American friends realize how unusual it is, how unique you are, and how blessed you are in having this system of being able to select your own candidates. Open primaries, referendums, initiative procedures, recall votes, the dispersal of power, states' rights, all of these things are modern incarnations of the old constitutional ideal of the dispersal of power, and it's worked. It's done what it was meant to do. It's done what the founders intended, which is to keep your government small.
So in this country, there are just many more ways in which ordinary citizens just a small group of ordinary citizens can find a place to take a stand and have a voice. Much harder to do in Europe. So the institutions are what impress you most.
Correct. I mean, a classic example in my own country being the issue of the European Union. The overwhelming majority of my constituents would like to leave the European Union. That is not a position publicly shared by any politicians, by any big newspaper, by any main political party. 55% of
even
people...
the Telegraph?
Yeah, even the Telegraph. No national newspaper wants to leave the European Union, even though all the readers of all the national newspapers...
Okay, now you're making another point, an additional point. I think it buttresses your argument, but it does seem to me distinct. There's no Fox News. There's no Rush Limbaugh. There's no alternative media. I have discovered only one website in all of Britain that's affiliated with it's affiliated loosely with the Tory party that seems to have something of a little bit of a tea flavor. One website, and how many dozens upon dozens of websites do we have here? Now, why is that?
Well, I think there are other websites, actually, and that is making a big difference. I mean, until very recently, there was a kind of media cartel, and you could kill a story just by not reporting it. Not out of conspiracy, but just because you didn't think it was important, because it didn't fit with your worldview. That is less and less true. I mean, the classic recent example being the leak of the University of East Anglia ClimateGate emails. Well, there was a Telegraph blogger called James Dellingpole who carried on harping on and on day after day about this story. And he had this great technique, which is to say, this is what the Times environment correspondent thinks is the top story today. This is what the Independent thinks is the top story. Right. When are they finally going to cover this? And in the end, they had to. Now, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, that wouldn't have happened. And, there was the disintermediation of the message, if you like, is, I think, of great value to free marketeers and conservatives generally, because it was by and large the soft left who had and still have the control of the old broadcast media. But it's also just a good thing for the truth. I mean, it's out of this clashing din of competing interpretations that we get the facts.
I'm struck by how many American liberals, you write in The New Road to Serfdom, now seem to see their country through European eyes, close quote. And this is subtitled A Letter of Warning to America. So give me in a sentence or two why that strikes you as perilous.
I mean, yeah, you meet a lot of these Americans in Europe, I suppose, understandably. Oh, we never voted for Bush. Oh, we're not like you think. We're terrible. We wish we had more of what you have. I come back to, you don't appreciate, well, not all of you, most of my American friends, quite understandably, take for granted what's familiar. And it's very rare to meet Americans who are appreciative of how extraordinary is the constitutional inheritance of this country, how successful the founders were in dispersing and democratizing power and constraining the state by doing that. What's happening now, it seems to me, the direction being pursued by this administration amounts to a comprehensive policy of Europeanization. European healthcare, right. European welfare, European climate targets, European disarmament. And if you make your country more like the rest of the world, less American, you will serve to make it less independent, less prosperous, less free. And that's our problem as well as yours. The world has benefited from a strong and engaged United States.
Segment 2. Let's take a few of those topics you mentioned. Quoting again, the economy, The New Road to Serfdom. Quote, "Here is Europe's economic tragedy. It suffers no worse than the United States during recessions, but it fails to recover to the same extent during the intervening upswings." So why not? Why is there less dynamism in the European economy?
There has been an enormous amount of legislation, well-intentioned legislation, aimed at giving social protection to employees. And it's now reached the stage in a lot of countries where it just isn't worth your while to hire people, because once you've done that, you won't be able to get rid of them. You become very nervous about taking people on in the good times because you know that you won't be able to get them off your books if things go bad. And this has led to a measure of structural unemployment, which historically has been much higher than that in the US. It's striking that unemployment in this country has just reached European levels at the same time that your government has expanded, you've started regulating the private sector, telling people how much they're allowed to be paid and so on. There's a connection between those two things. In the short term, you can have the paternity leave, the vacations, but in the long term, the money runs out.
Well, okay, so let me try that. First couple of decades after the Second World War, you look at the statistics in Western Europe and the United States, and people work about the same number of hours each year.
Right.
And then about beginning in the 1970s, Europeans begin passing legislation, shortening the work week, lengthening vacations, and so forth. And Americans, amazingly enough, start working even more hours per year. So the figures diverge. Now, the argument would be, by the 1970s, the Europeans had recovered from the ravages of the Second World War, and then some, achieving the highest living standard their continent, or indeed mankind, had ever experienced. Well, life is nice in Paris. Why not stroll down the Champs-Élysées? Why not shorten your work week and take more vacation? Right. Or in Britain, why not have a little more time to fly down to the Costa del Sol? That's sane. Relax, enjoy life. It's we Americans who are pathologically driven to achieve unthinkingly. Doesn't that make sense?
Oh, that is exactly the argument. And what you're missing is what's inside. I mean, going back to your strutting boulevardier in Paris. I mean, outwardly he's beautifully turned out with his waistcoat and his silver-topped cane. Inside he's rotted with syphilis. You know, something has gone badly wrong, and we're discovering it now. You're right. During the first couple of decades after the Second World War, Europe did indeed bounce back with extraordinary verve and vigor. Partly because it was coming back from an artificial low. I mean, the war had degraded infrastructure but had not wiped out an industrious and educated workforce. Partly because there was migration for the first time, huge movement of people from the Mediterranean to Northern Europe. And partly, which we shouldn't underestimate, because they were getting a massive external stimulus in the form of US subsidy. The Marshall Plan...
I might also add the Germans under Erhard the Wirtschaft, they embraced free markets.
They embraced free markets, but I mean, but I wouldn't.
That placed a limit on what De Gaulle could do.
But here's the thing: you see, I mean, first of all, just to stress the Marshall Aid point, we're talking serious money. I mean, $13 billion between 1948 and 1952.
$1 billion was real money.
Exactly, $1 billion here, $1 billion there. Plus, even more valuable, the security guarantee, which meant that money that would have otherwise had to go on defence was being freed up for other things. Now, of course, human nature being what it is, the leaders of Europe round about the 60s and early 70s didn't say, well, of course we've grown because of the artificial low and because of the American assistance. What they said, understandably, was, we've grown because we have found this fantastic, brilliant model, which is kind of between socialism and capitalism, the mixed market economy, the tripartite negotiations of government and labour unions and employers. And, as I say, in the short term, what's not to like? But there comes a point when you realise that you've been funding this on credit, that you've been depending on external assistance, and that your productivity has fallen further and further behind until you've got to the stage that we've now reached, where it takes 4 Germans to work the same hours as 3 Americans. Mm-hmm. And that, in the long term, is just not sustainable. Europe, now that it's in a globalized economy, competing against China and India and indeed North America, finds that it is shrinking precipitately. In the 1970s, in 1974, Europe accounted for 36%, or Western Europe, for 36% of world GDP. Today, it's 25%. 10 years from now, it'll be 15%. I mean, that is an extraordinary decline over a period when the US share of world GDP has remained pretty steady, around about 26%. So there was always going to be a reckoning, and I'm afraid that reckoning has come now.
Healthcare, the new road to serfdom. Once politicians assume responsibility for healthcare, they find that they have made an almost irreversible, emphasis for my purposes on that word, irreversible decision. Why is that irreversible?
Because you are responsible for everybody lying on a trolley in a hospital corridor for want of a bed. And anything that goes wrong can be blamed on lack of resources. And therefore, you find that you're in a situation where nobody... I mean, at the last election, all 3 British parties went into the campaign promising substantial reductions in public spending. All 3 of them had to tack on an exemption saying, but not healthcare, that budget will continue to grow in perpetuity. Because politically it's impossible. I mean, and actually morally it's impossible. How can you, as it were, be responsible for somebody suffering a preventable condition for lack of resources? You know, unless they are in some way responsible for their own resources, it puts you as the minister in an almost impossible position.
And I've always found it striking that even Mrs. Thatcher is the way to put this one, even Mrs. Thatcher, who sold off the council houses and privatized one industry after another and broke the unions in the coal strikes, never touched the National Health Service.
And her Chancellor, Nigel Lawson, after he retired, made a very striking observation as to why. He said the National Health Service is the closest thing we have to a religion. And the way the voter sees it is you have these sacerdotal figures, the doctors and the nurses, and then you have these laymen who call themselves the government. And plainly, for the laymen to tell the priests how to run their affairs, or indeed how to reform themselves in any way, is intolerable.
Also in Don't Copy Europe, the family. Again, I quote, the new road to serfdom. Quote, the state has assumed control over functions that were once discharged within families, health, education, daycare, provision for the elderly. So it is perhaps no surprise that the family itself in Europe is in decline. Explain that one.
Very few babies. Demographers say you
have to give me draw the line from the growth of the welfare state to the plummeting of the birth rate.
I mean, it's not a simple line. The two things are not immediately sequential. There are other things going on. There's a whole bunch of reasons why the birth rate has been in decline, to do with the spread of contraception, women working. And some of these are very good things, and I don't want to oversimplify. It is striking, nonetheless, that the first generation raised with cradle-to-grave welfare, the first generation to be excused the traditional responsibilities of adulthood, was the first one also to give up on parenthood. When the state expands, it squeezes out the private sphere. There was a time not so very long ago when any adult seeing a child out of school in term time would have said, why aren't you in class? Now that's seen as the government's job. There was a time not so very long ago when we all had to look out for our elderly neighbours and make sure they were collecting their milk every morning. That is now seen as social services. The real problem with the growth of welfareism is not that it retards economic growth, although it does. I mean, of course, it makes the economy grow more slowly, that's true. But in a way, that is the least of our problems. The real malignancy is the way it frays the bonds that used to tie society together. It makes us less virtuous as individual citizens, and it infantilizes us. It makes us less likely to take on our responsibilities.
What Europeans most disdain in America is cultural conservatism. But I can't help noticing that values voters in the United States seem to be keeping up their numbers. Just as the United States is outbreeding Europe, so the Republicans are outbreeding the Democrats.
There's a happy thought. Yeah, you go along to the mega churches in the Bible Belt offend European tastes, but there are plenty of children in their Sunday schools.
And after the 2010 census figures come down, they will pick up, those portions of the country will pick up seats in the Congress.
But I think that there is a general point about optimism and creating, if you like, a philoprogenitive society, a society where people want to have babies. The only European country that is breeding at replacement levels is Albania. The only place in Europe where the population would be growing without immigration, or at least sustaining itself. Turkey, the same if you count Turkey as a European country. I used to go to Turkey when my kids were babies, and I discovered that it is a perfectly normal thing in Turkey for a passing stranger of either sex to grab a baby out of a pram and lift it up in the air and say, "Thanks be to God." Now that doesn't happen in London very often.
No.
And I can't help thinking that there is probably a connection, that in a society where
well, now, careful. So what's the connection? You just named two countries. You're not suggesting that it's because Albania and Turkey have smaller welfare states?
Oh, well, they do. They have much, much smaller welfare states, and they have much more important families.
Well, and you have also just named the two Muslim countries in Europe.
Indeed, they are less secularized.
So, all right. So you're making a point about the welfare state or about religion or both?
Again, those two things are not completely separate. As the state grows, the private sphere shrinks, and part of the private sphere is the role of the churches.
Okay. Segment 4, America in the World. Again, let me quote The New Road to Serfdom. Throughout the 1990s, the realization gradually dawned on the Europeans that they no longer needed U.S. military protection, close quote. From which, what followed?
Well, the European Union was able to assert itself as a distinct entity which had different and sometimes opposed values to the United States. Now, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that. The US doesn't have a monopoly on right any more than any other country does. But if you look at the particular issues on which the European Union has challenged Washington, you see a mindset in Europe that is not particularly conducive to freedom and democracy. I mean, imagine a map of the world. Where on that map are the biggest causes of dispute between the US and Europe? I would say that they are Iran, where the European Union is trying to jolly the Ayatollahs out of their nuclear ambitions by being nice to them, constructive engagement. Israel-Palestine, the EU takes very seriously its role as the main funder of the Palestinian state, to the extent that it is having to circumvent its own rules on not financing terrorist organizations so as to keep funneling money to Hamas. China, where the EU has declared in principle its readiness to sell arms to the regime in Beijing, even though it hasn't yet sold any, and where it continues to isolate Taiwan. And I would add, let's say, supranationalism, the International Criminal Court, the landmine treaties, the G20 and Kyoto processes and so on. Now, on all of those, you see an ideological difference between Washington and Brussels. Washington is pushing for democracy rather than stability. The EU is pushing for stability rather than democracy. Both of them, if you like, are being true to their foundational principles. The US was born out of a popular revolt against a remote and autocratic government, and so its sympathy to this day, other things being equal, tends to be with democratization.
Now, Daniel, you want the United States to remain self-confident, to retain the will to project its military power, to continue a central role in Europe, the Middle East, China, and so you want all of that, right? Now, let me suggest to you an American point of view, which involves one part fatigue and one part exasperation. You said a moment ago that the European Union was able to assert itself. and you give example after example after example where they asserted themselves through talk, but really only through talk. So Milosevic gets out of control in the Balkans, and the Europeans are totally impotent. They simply do not pull themselves together to move in and contain a situation which is on their own continent. Only the armed forces of the United States raining bombs on Serbs brings that situation under control. Or, I give you an example from just a fortnight ago. Use the English term for 2 weeks just to make you feel at home here. When we now know that terrorist plans for Mumbai-style attacks were discovered. These attacks were to take place in Britain and France and perhaps elsewhere in Europe. Now then, who rains down predator bombs on Pakistan and Afghanistan to try to disrupt that plot? Who puts their troops in harm's way to try to contain that situation, to address that situation? And who, to this very moment, has not heard from a single European office holder so much as a single merci? So why should Americans continue to bear the burdens and the insults of the Europeans?
Take up the white man's burden and reap his old reward. The blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. I mean, not exclusively a white man's burden now, of course, but don't expect any thanks from those ye guard. That's not how human nature works. Some Europeans have been, almost since the Second World War, driven by this pathological need to bite the hand that freed them.
Can you argue to me from the point of view of American interests why we should continue to put up with these insults?
By the way, I don't think it is in America's interest to maintain costly and ungrateful garrisons all over the world. I think you need to be selective about where you do it.
Okay, hold on. Then let me back up just a little bit farther, because during the 1980s, the late Irving Kristol, are you familiar with his work? Okay. The late Irving Kristol was a kind of, this is even during the Reagan years, he said, you know, NATO is getting a bit out of hand here. That made sense. Our spending a lot of money and having troops in Europe made sense when Europe was still recovering after the Second World War. But these are all rich countries now. We are infantilizing them. We should bring our troops home and let the Europeans defend them, Western Europe, of course, let them defend themselves, because we must not cocoon them from reality. Let them encounter reality itself. Was he right about that?
Well, in terms of NATO, I think he was ahead of his time. No one would invent today an organization primarily designed to defend West Germany from a massed assault by Soviet T-72s. And yet, you know, if I look at the world now, where is the biggest deployment of British troops? Massively, the largest overseas garrison is not Iraq or Afghanistan. We have 22,000 soldiers in West Germany.
And we have 50,000.
Right. So
why?
Because no bureaucracy ever volunteers to disband itself.
I'll put the argument to you and then let you address it, let you answer it. The argument runs as follows. The United States is now in about the same position that Britain was in the middle of the last century, right? So China's rising, India's rising. We concede our place as the superpower gracefully or with ill grace, but cede it we must. And do you want to know why that's an appealing argument to the people who have to burden the responsibilities of being the superpower? Because you look at George Bush, who did the best he could, discharging the responsibilities of the United States as an international enforcer of peace and proponent of democracy, and the man is reviled. And the man in Britain who stood up for him, Tony Blair, is covered in spittle at this stage in his career.
Not solely because of that.
No. Well, I mean,
there were loads of reasons for people to be spitting at him.
Yes, but that. Well, you're British, so I won't argue with you. But as best I can tell, that is certainly the signal reason that he went into Iraq.
That's why he was reviled on the left. There are loads of reasons why he's reviled by conservatives.
Completely different and correct reasons to revile him on the right, but that's a separate program. And now we have Barack Obama looking for, read that Bob Woodward book. He's trying to find his way here. Yeah. And what he senses is a political reality that if he commits himself to Afghanistan, his own party will be against him. And furthermore, the great mass of the American people are just tired of it all. So why shouldn't the United States look at Britain and say, you know, they actually had pretty good lives once they laid down their empire. They go off to the city, they make a lot of money, they lead quite interesting culture, but it's not a bad life to be number 2 or number 3 instead of number 1. What's wrong with that argument?
Well, I mean, I don't think that it always needs to be the US who goes in. I think you can afford to be a little bit more picky about this. And there is a downside, definitely, to running an expensive foreign policy. There is a downside in terms of expense, and there is a downside in terms of domestic freedom. There is a contradiction in Russell Kirk's phrase between an American republic and an American empire. That said, I'm glad you got the big calls right. I mean, I think the world is a happier place because the United States played its part in defeating fascism and defeating the Soviet tyranny. So it's not an all or nothing. I mean, you can question some of the forward foreign policy positions without being a pacifist, and I think
So you'd at least let me argue for bringing those 50,000 troops in West Germany home.
I mean, it's crazy for them to be there, yeah. Right. Yeah, no, I mean, by the way, I think that for the US, I want the world is fortunate at the moment in its superpower. We basically, with all the occasional errors that your country makes, as all countries do, I am glad that the preponderant power in the world is a liberal capitalist democracy rather than being Russia or China, right? Or the European Union.
All right, segment 5, last segment. What is to be done? I quote you to yourself. You were writing in the Telegraph in March 2008. I'm sure you know what's coming because you've got to live this one down. I'm for Obama. You wrote those words. I'm for Obama. As a conservative and as a friend of America, I see huge attractions in an Obama presidency. Close quote. Explain yourself.
All right. First of all, it was very difficult to muster much enthusiasm for the Republican Party by 2008. This was a party which, at its best, had done extraordinary things for freedom and democracy in this country, the party of Reagan, the party of the contract with America. But by the time of the 2008 presidential election, it had gone in a different direction. It had become a party of external protectionism and tariffs, a party that was striking down states' rights, a party that had massively expanded the federal government, the budget deficit, a party that had become...
States' rights would be what? The No Child Left Behind Act?
In the field of education, in the field of euthanasia, in the field of same-sex unions. I mean, wherever you stand on those issues, surely they are things that you can negotiate for yourself through your own democratic mechanisms and procedures state by state. It is crazy for Washington to be stepping in and telling
so George W. Bush and Tom DeLay
and then
spent too much money.
All of that. And then when you thought it couldn't get any worse, they became a party of bailouts and nationalizations. It was very difficult by the end of 2008 to feel much enthusiasm for them. Barack Obama seemed to me someone who would make the US more popular, would provoke a certain amount of soul-searching from some of the more knee-jerk anti-Americans. It would cause them to re-examine their prejudices, which it did, actually. Let's be fair about that. I had no idea then that the federal state would be 30% bigger now than it was then.
I was about to say, you've set me up to feel merciful, but you still have to make your confession.
He campaigned, it seems an eternity ago, on a promise of tax cuts.
Right.
To put it as neutrally as possible, that isn't what's happened.
So when did you recognize that this man, that there was this was not going the way you had hoped or expected?
He was dealt a bad hand with the financial crisis, but he did not play it as I had hoped he would. He'd set himself up as a bipartisan figure. He came to national attention in the first place with that speech about not slicing and dicing and having red states and blue states. He had positioned himself, it seemed to me, as somebody who could do what a president is meant to do, which is to be above party. When people said of him, he's all things to all men, I would say, well, where is the dishonor in that? The phrase comes from, as you know, from 1 Corinthians. Paul says, I'll come as a Jew to the Jew, as a Greek to the Greeks. That's what a president's meant to do.
I excuse you, but only on grounds of youth, Daniel. You've made your one mistake that Americans will permit you. Now, to prevent the Europeanization of America, you have to identify the reasons for it, right? So what is the political or even the psychological mechanism? You have just laid out briefly on this program in detail in this book why it would be a terrible mistake for the United States to copy Europe with regard to immigration or healthcare or the economy or welfare or anything else. And yet here we are doing it. So what's the impulse? Why? Why does Barack Obama want this country to look more European?
By and large, politicians are more warm about expansions of state power than the rest of us. And the reason why politicians like an expansion of state power is because they personally stand to benefit. I don't mean that. I don't mean to imply that they're corrupt or anything like that. It's just that they think they have the answers. We all do. It's natural to think that, and therefore you tend to be more impatient with constraints on your own power than you are on somebody else's. But the great thing about this country is that because of the system your founders designed, you still have the ability to control them.
Right. So the impulse is just, what it comes down to really is the usual self-seeking impulse of the priestly caste.
Right, but people are almost always wiser than their leaders. I mean, I was really struck this week. I left France and it was on strike. as usual, because Sarkozy is raising the retirement age to 31 or something. And people were marching with banners saying, let's block the economy and strike till you retire, right? Which is not going to be very long under the current system. And then you arrive here, and there are crowds on the street with banners saying, don't tread on me, taxed enough already, who is John Galt? You know, guess which country is growing faster?
God bless America. So, in The New Road to Serfdom, you write, let me close with a heartfelt imprecation. Honor the genius of your founders, preserve the freedom of your nation. To whom do you address that? Republican leaders, Rush Limbaugh listeners, Sarah Palin? Whom? Just what segment? Who do you expect to be able to stand up and change things?
This is addressed to everybody. Hayek addressed the original Road to Serfdom famously to socialists in all parties. He had also perceived the way in which political leaders tend to be keener on the centralization of power than the rest of us. There's a wonderful line of Edmund Burke. He was in his reflections on the French Revolution, talking about the way in which people are wiser than the chattering classes, where he said, because half a dozen crickets concealed beneath a fern make the field ring with their importunate chink, while thousands of great cattle chew the cud in the shade of the great British oak and are silent, pray do not imagine that those who make all the noise are the only inhabitants of the field. In this country, as in mine, as everywhere else, people are wiser than their leaders. I will always repose my trust in the oxen rather than the grasshoppers, you know, and I think you're going to be imposing yourself on the grasshoppers in a couple of weeks' time.
Two views of America at this moment. One is economist Thomas Sowell. Quote, to follow Rome, one of the greatest civilizations of all time as it degenerated and fractured, is especially painful in view of the parallels to what is happening in America in our own times. Historian Paul Ray, the political moment in which we live is a moment of great, great hope. The Obama administration is a gift to the friends of liberty. Decline and fall, rebirth and liberty. What's your assessment?
The decline and fall of Rome happened because it became bureaucratized, taxed, centralized. It's what brings a civilization down in the end. Same thing happened to the Mings, to the Mughals, to the Ottomans. The genius of the West was pluralism, variety, the dispersal of power, personal enterprise and freedom. And that reached its highest incarnation in the old courthouse in Philadelphia, which is why when I see this country making the same mistakes that the rest of the world has done, going down this road towards federal czars, more regulation, higher taxes, when I see power shifting from the 50 states to Washington, from the elected representative to the federal bureaucrat, from the state, from the citizen to the state, as a British conservative who likes to think of this country as being a repository for our traditional concepts of British freedom, that really pains me. You deserve better as a people, and the world deserves better.
Penultimate question. The frontispiece of The New Road to Serfdom comes from Thomas Paine's famous pamphlet, Common Sense, 1776, quote, the cause of America is in great measure the cause of all mankind, close quote. Why did you choose that?
Like him, I am a British subject interested and involved in the survival and success of American freedom. You will perhaps allow me a measure of additional pride as a British conservative when I look at the structures of this country, when I say that they were not dreamed up in a vacuum. If you go back and you look at what the Patriot leaders were arguing at the time, they didn't see themselves as revolutionaries. They saw themselves as conservatives. As far as they were concerned, all they were asserting was what they had always assumed to be their birthright as Englishmen. Mm-hmm. And that's why, I don't think I'm unusual, actually, among my countrymen in this regard. When I look at the success of this country, it's like a man looking at the success of a wealthy nephew who may have become wealthier than him, and you sometimes have to tease him a little bit, but secretly you're bursting with pride because you can see that it's the same ideology.
Final question. Our interview will air just a few days before the election. If you could address one sentence to Americans to ponder just before going into the voting booth, what would you say, Daniel?
Be aware of how lucky you are, how unique you are. This country has been made different from the rest of the world because of a sublime set of institutions that were designed by exceptional men. If one generation of leaders presumes to strike down those institutions in the name of short-term contingency, it will make your country less American, by which I mean less prosperous, less democratic, less free.
Daniel Hannan, author of The New Road to Serfdom, A Letter of Warning to America. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge and the Hoover Institution. Thank you.